All right, so let's talk about blood. Okay, yes, it's kind of fitting. We're in October. So we're in October, so it's probably fitting to talk about blood. All right. So functions of blood: transport, defense, and regulation. Okay. So obviously with transport, you're carrying oxygen to your different tissues in your body. You're carrying carbon dioxide, other waste away from the tissues. Okay. You bring the oxygen to the tissues, you take carbon dioxide and waste away. Okay. You're also transporting hormones. Remember, we spent a whole chapter just now talking about hormones. And some of those get transported from one organ to another. So under defense, blood's also helping your body defend itself against foreign pathogens. Okay, it also gets rid of dead cells and dying cells. Okay. And under regulation, your blood helps you regulate things like body temperature, your pH, whether your blood is too basic or too acidic. Also balanced with water and salt. All right. So what's in your blood? Well, one of the big components of your blood is plasma. Okay, it's the liquid portion in your blood. And 90%, 92% of that liquid is water. And 8% have various different salts, other organic molecules in them. And you also have proteins. Those are some of your organic molecules, right? Because remember, organic means you have what 3 elements? Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, right? But mostly carbon. Okay. So some of the plasma proteins include albumins, globulins. You have alpha globulin and beta globulin. These are made in the liver. You also have gamma globulin. Okay, helps you with antibodies. So you also have fibrinogen. Okay, helps you form your blood clots. So you get fibrous tissue that the clot. Your plasma also helps you with homeostasis. Okay, some of those functions we just talked about in the previous slide. All right, so we're going to talk about these in more detail, but just wanted to show you this chart. So you've got your red blood cells, your white blood cells, platelets. These are called formed elements. We'll go into this in more detail. All right, you can kind of see pictures of what each of these different cell types look like. All right. You also have your plasma. Okay. So, and again, your plasma is mostly water. Okay. Some plasma proteins. In your blood, you were to kind of separate out your blood into different sections. About a little over half is plasma. A little under half is the formed elements, and then you've got a little bit, it's called a buffy coat. Okay. All right, let's talk more about those formed elements. So where are they made? They're made in your red bone marrow. Okay, so remember we talked about skeletal system and that medullary cavity. Okay, so I'm tying back to things you studied before, so you can kind of remember when we get back to the final exam, you'll kind of be able to connect dots a little bit better, right? So specifically in the red bone marrow, in the ribs, skull, vertebrae, iliac crest, and the ends of long bones. So if you're trying to remember that, I would arrange those first letters and try to make a word. Doesn't really make a real word, but you could do serve or virus or something like that and help you remember those. Okay. And then just related to what we just talked about, if you think about it, if you're trying to look for red bone marrow, if you needed to get more, want to know where these formed elements were, these are places where you would go to get more of that. Okay. All right. But here we're talking ends of long bones. You got to remember what we call the ends of long bones? Yes. Epiphysis, yes. The diaphysis in the middle, that's where more of your yellow bone marrow would be, where you get your immune cells. But just want to make sure, again, that's why we're kind of bringing this stuff back out, okay? So I want to make sure you know that. And remember, iliac is part of your hip, right? Part of that os coxae. All right, so let's talk about hematopoiesis, okay? Everybody say hematopoiesis. All right, so you can pronounce big words, right? It's a cool thing about this class. All right, so these are involved, you have involved with the multipotent stem cells. Multipotent means you can differentiate into a lot of different things, multiple things, okay? So, and they can become red bone marrow cells. All right, and these cells will replicate, right? They're going to divide a lot. Then the daughter cells are going to differentiate into other types of cells, more specific types of cells. Okay, you get these myeloid stem cells, and they go through even more differentiation. So you get red blood cells, you get what we call granular leukocytes, you get monocytes, and you get megakaryocytes. All right, and so the leukocytes and the monocytes, we typically refer to these generally as white blood cells, but there are specific types. Okay. So the lymphatic system, or stem cells of the lymphatic system, will differentiate to produce lymphocytes. So that's why lymphocytes have their name, because they are cells that have a lymphatic function. Okay. So here's a visual, okay? So don't get overwhelmed by this. Just kind of look at what's the main point of what's this trying to tell me. So here we've got multipotent stem cells on the ends of the long bone, right? So some of them will differentiate into myeloid stem cells. Some of those myeloid stem cells will differentiate into erythroblasts. Remember, blasts are building, so they're going to become red blood cells or erythrocytes. Some of these myeloid stem cells will differentiate into megakaryoblast, which make megakaryocytes, which make your platelets. All right, and platelets are kind of like cell fragments. Okay. All right, some of the myeloid stem cells will differentiate into myeloblasts, helps you create your granular leukocytes, like your eosinophils, basophils, and neutrophils. Some of your myeloid stem cells will differentiate to form monoblasts, which develop into monocytes. Okay, some of these multipotent stem cells will differentiate to form lymphatic stem cells, which will differentiate into lymphoblasts, which make your B and your T lymphocytes. Your B lymphocytes are processed in the bone marrow, your T lymphocytes are processed in the thymus. Remember we learned about the thymus in the last chapters? That endocrine gland is located just superior to the heart, okay? And all of these on the right side, these are all different types of white blood cells, okay? Okay, so let's talk specifically about red blood cells. They are small and they're said to be biconcave, which basically means on either side they kind of curve in, okay? So, and they are also anucleate, which means there's no nucleus in them. So that's something that's unique about red blood cells. So, and you have a lot of them because you need a lot of them. Between 4 and 6 million per cubic millimeter, okay? So millimeter is pretty small, right? Cubic millimeter is pretty small. What do? Well, they help us transport oxygen. Okay, you go get oxygen from the lungs, need a place to hold on to them until you get to the tissues. They have hemoglobin inside of them. Okay, it's a respiratory pigment. So oxyhemoglobin, you create that when hemoglobin binds to oxygen. Okay. So hemoglobin that doesn't combine with oxygen, we call that deoxyhemoglobin. All right. So deoxy means doesn't have oxygen. All right, I don't have that. Let's see. So production of the red blood cells. So your myeloid stem cells are going to give rise to your erythroblasts. We saw that in the picture. Those erythroblasts are going to go through multiple cell divisions. Those cells will start to mature. Those erythroblasts will start accumulating lots of hemoglobin. And they'll start losing their nucleus. They also will lose most of their organelles. And your mature red blood cells can only live around 120 days. Okay, because remember, they're basically just storage vessels. Okay, no nucleus, most organelles are not there. So they don't really have a lot of machinery inside of them to sustain themselves. And just like we said, there's a lot per cubic millimeter, so you got to make around 2 million red blood cells per second just to keep your count of red blood cells in homeostasis, so you don't start having a net loss. So a chemical called erythropoietin will help produce or stimulate the production of red blood cells and help them mature. Okay. So it's an important chemical, helps us maintain our red blood cell homeostasis. Okay, so we've got a picture here. It's a circle, so it tells us there's going to be probably some homeostasis involved. So here you have your oxygen level in the blood's low. Okay, it serves as a stimulus for the kidneys to increase producing erythropoietin. That chemical is going to go through the bloodstream, go to the bones. Stem cells there are going to increase their production of red blood cells. Okay, by doing that, you can return your blood level of oxygen back to normal. Okay, the body's able to perceive the level of oxygen is normal and stimulus is resolved. Okay. So I told you before, red blood cells only last about 120 days, right? So if they don't last, you have to have a way to get rid of them. So they're going to get destroyed in the liver and the spleen. So the liver and the spleen, excuse my crude analogy, but they're kind of like, you know, the garbage furnace, right? So like the toys in Toy Story where they're almost about to get burned up in the furnace. It's kind of where the old red blood cells go, right? So, okay, I got a couple chuckles. That's good. All right. So, all right. So hemoglobin gets released from those red blood cells that are dying or just being destroyed. The globin part of the hemoglobin gets broken off and broken down into amino acids. Okay. And those amino acids can get recycled. The iron gets recovered because hemoglobin also carries iron. and it gets recovered and returned back to the bone marrow, and you can use it again. And the heme portion of your hemoglobin just gets broken down or degraded. It gets excreted out of your body as bile pigments by the liver. All right, so because bile is, we haven't gotten to this yet because we haven't really covered the digestive system, but it's basically produced your liver, stored in your gallbladder. But these bile pigments include bilirubin and biliverdin. Okay, so they help basically degrade and excrete the heme portion of hemoglobin. All right. So, medical condition related to informed elements is anemia. Okay, it's an illness that's characterized by being tired. And part of that has to do with cells not getting enough oxygen. And that happens because of decreased levels of hemoglobin or decreased numbers of red blood cells. Okay. Anemia can also be caused by hemolysis, or basically breaking down of your blood cells, okay, red blood cells in particular. So, sometimes people who have anemia have to take iron. They don't have enough iron in their diet. And that helps them to be able to bind more oxygen in their hemoglobin. All right, so we've talked a lot about red blood cells. Let's take a break and talk to your partner, share what you learned about red blood cells. You can do this at home as well. So we've covered red blood cells in detail. Let's talk a little bit about white blood cells before we finish up for today. So the white blood cells typically are going to be large relative to the red blood cells. And they do have nuclei, okay? Big difference. But they also do not contain hemoglobin, okay? Because they're not really oxygen storing vessels, okay? They just need enough to do the normal metabolism, right? So you'll have about 5,000 to 11,000 per cubic millimeter. So a lot less than what you have for red blood cells, right? So what are they good for? Help you fight infection. That's one of the big things that you need white blood cells for. All right, they also can destroy dead cells, dying cells. They can recognize bad cells. They can recognize cancerous cells and kill them, okay? So extremely important. So if you don't have them, you're gonna have lots of problems. So how do we develop them? Well, we saw in that picture, they're going to be developed from stem cells that come from your red blood marrow. And they are able to diffuse out of your bloodstream when needed, okay, if there's a site of some infection. All right, and here's a capillary, and we haven't covered cardiovascular system yet, but capillaries are basically tiny blood vessels that are designed for diffusion, okay, and some sort of exchange. So here the capillary has a white blood cells in it, and here's a white blood cell, and it is diffusing out into some connective tissue. Okay. So the capillary has essentially openings where white blood cells can get out. So some different kinds of white blood cells. You have the granular leukocytes. You've got your neutrophils. Okay, these are going to be the more abundant ones. You have lots of these relative to the others. So they are sort of your first responder, okay, when you have some sort of infection. And they're going to engulf pathogens during phagocytosis, okay, so they're going to eat something and break it down. The eosinophils, they're going to increase the number. They'll increase in number if you get some sort of parasitic worm infection, okay? So they're able to respond to that. And they can actually reduce your allergic reaction if you have an allergic attack. You also have basophils. Basophils release histamines. They can dilate your blood vessels and make your smooth muscle constrict. All right. They also release heparin. Okay, heparin is involved in preventing blood clotting. Also helps blood to flow. Okay. So you may have heard on either working in healthcare or watching TV shows, and like, well, we got to give this person a heparin stat. That's what they're talking about. So they're either trying to prevent clotting or they're trying to promote blood flow to some area of the body. Okay, the agranular leukocytes, these are your lymphocytes and your monocytes. So the lymphocytes are involved in specific immunity. So you're being immune to something very specific, okay? It's not generalized, okay? So there's different lymphocytes with different specificity, okay? So it can be, each different type of leukocyte could give you sort of immunity to something different. And they can recognize cancer cells and destroy them. The B lymphocytes, they are involved in producing antibodies. So I think of the B or B lymphocyte as the B in antibodies, okay? The T lymphocytes, they are your attack cells, okay? So they attack and destroy cells that have some sort of foreign antigen. And so there's concept I want you to make sure you understand is there's antigens and antibodies. So antigens are basically an invader. Antibody fights the antigen, okay? You also have the monocytes. They're the larger cell or the largest cells that you'll see in the white blood cells. And they're going to differentiate into different types of cells, particularly macrophages. Remember, macrophages are phagocytes. They can eat things, break them down. Eat things like pathogens, old cells, cellular debris, or just kind of waste in cells. And they can also stimulate other white blood cells and help them get involved in helping defend your body. Okay. All right. So I'll stop there and give you all a moment to talk about the difference of different white blood cells. All right, and that's going to conclude our presentation for today, and we'll pick up here at platelets and hemostasis in our next video.